Late 1944. Patton's Third Army is deep in enemy territory planning their next major offensive. George Patton has just discovered that someone in his own headquarters has been feeding Hitler every move he's planning to make. A spy in his inner circle, selling American soldiers' lives to the Nazis. When Patton found out who it was, he didn't call military police, he didn't file a report, and he didn't follow protocol. What he did instead became one of the most controversial moments of his entire career, and revealed exactly why Patton was the general Hitler feared most. This is the story of how Patton caught a traitor red-handed and delivered justice in the most Patton way possible. Late evening at Third Army headquarters. Most of the staff has gone to sleep. The building is quiet except for the night watch and a few officers working late on planning documents. Patton has a habit that drives his staff crazy. He prowls the headquarters at odd hours, checking on operations and reviewing plans. On this particular night, Patton notices a light on in one of the document rooms, a secured area where classified operational plans are stored. It's past midnight. No one should be in there without authorization. Patton approaches silently. He peers through the small window in the door, and what he sees makes his blood run cold. A sergeant, one of the clerical staff who had been with headquarters for months, is photographing documents. He has a small camera and is methodically taking pictures of troop movements, supply routes, and everything the Germans would need to anticipate the Third Army's next moves. The sergeant doesn't realize he's been caught until Patton's voice cuts through the silence like a knife. "What the hell do you think you're doing, soldier?" The sergeant spins around, camera in hand, caught red-handed. His face goes white as the camera falls from his trembling fingers. Patton steps into the room and closes the door behind him. The sergeant stammers lies about working late or having authorization, but both men know the truth. Patton calls for 2 MPs and has the man arrested and brought to his office immediately. The sergeant wasn't a planted enemy agent. He was an American born and raised in the Midwest who had enlisted after Pearl Harbor. He had served competently for years, working his way into a position of trust. As investigators would later discover, German intelligence had approached him months earlier with offers of substantial cash. He rationalized it, telling himself the information wasn't that important and that he was just making extra money on the side. But people were getting hurt. American soldiers were dying because German forces knew where to position defenses and when to expect attacks. Every ambush that succeeded and every artillery barrage that hit with suspicious accuracy was tied to this sergeant's information. The night Patton caught him, the sergeant had been photographing plans for a major offensive. If those documents had reached the Germans, thousands of American soldiers would have walked into a prepared killing zone. Patton did not raise his voice after the arrest. That detail would later stand out to officers who knew his temper. Instead, he dismissed the MPs once the sergeant was secured and stood alone in his office, staring at the wall map that showed Third Army's advance stretching across France toward the German frontier. Pins marked units that had fought for weeks without rest. Supply lines snaked eastward, thin and vulnerable. Every arrow on the map represented men who would die if the enemy knew where the blow was coming next. The discovery did not shock Patton because betrayal was unimaginable. It shocked him because it confirmed something he had already sensed. German reactions had been too precise. Counterattacks appeared where American forces should have found weakness. Artillery fire had fallen with timing that suggested foreknowledge rather than coincidence. Patton had blamed chance, whether even his own staff's optimism. Now the pattern had a face. Protocol demanded that Army counterintelligence be notified immediately, that the suspect be transferred, interrogated, processed through formal channels. Patton understood the rules as well as anyone. He also understood time. Whatever the sergeant had already passed on could not be taken back, and whatever remained in his possession might still be recoverable. Delay carried its own body count. The interrogation that followed was brief and clinical. Patton asked few questions, but each one was direct. When had the contact begun? How the information was passed? Whether copies existed beyond the photographs already taken? The sergeant resisted at first, then collapsed under the weight of what he had done. He spoke not out of ideology but fear, fear of exposure, fear of consequences, fear that the damage was already irreversible. What emerged was not a master spy network but something more unsettling: opportunism. German intelligence officers operating behind the lines had identified a vulnerable man with access, exploited his financial desperation, and turned him into a steady source of operational insight. It was not elegant espionage. It was effective. Patton listened without interruption. He did not argue or threaten. When the sergeant finished speaking, the general asked a single question that cut past motive and explanation. Had any material from that night already been transmitted? The answer was no. The photographs were still in the camera. That answer mattered. It meant the offensive could still be altered, routes could be shifted, timetables adjusted, units repositioned. The enemy might sense something coming, but they would not know where the hammer would fall. The damage, for the moment, could be contained. Patton summoned his chief of staff and operations officers before dawn. No mention was made of a spy. Plans were quietly rewritten, maps replaced, orders retyped. Movements that had taken weeks to coordinate were altered in hours. Subordinate commanders were told only that intelligence assessments had changed. They trusted the order because they trusted the man issuing it. The sergeant was transferred out of headquarters before sunrise, officially logged as reassigned pending investigation. Within days, Counterintelligence would take custody, and the case would disappear into classified files. There would be no announcement, no public reckoning, no dramatic court-martial in front of assembled troops. The war allowed little space for spectacle. What made the episode controversial later was not that Patton acted outside the system, but how completely he contained the incident. Very few officers ever learned how close Third Army had come to catastrophe. Fewer still understood how much of Patton's reputation for intuition was rooted in his ruthless attention to patterns others dismissed. The incident reinforced something Patton already believed, that the most dangerous threats were rarely obvious. They did not always come from enemy armor or fortified lines. Sometimes they sat quietly at a desk, wore the same uniform, and moved unnoticed through the machinery of war. Against that kind of danger, aggression alone was useless. Vigilance mattered more. In the weeks that followed, Third Army surged forward with renewed unpredictability. German forces struggled to anticipate movements that no longer followed expected rhythms. Counterattacks arrived late or in the wrong places. The window the enemy had briefly opened slammed shut without explanation. For Patton, the matter was never about punishment. It was about control. Control of information, control of tempo, control of uncertainty. He understood that war was not only fought with tanks and artillery, but with decisions made in silence under pressure, where hesitation could be fatal and certainty was a luxury no commander could afford. In the aftermath, Patton quietly ordered a review of access procedures across Third Army headquarters. The changes were subtle enough not to disrupt operations, but firm enough to close vulnerabilities that had been ignored in the rush of pursuit. Document rooms adopted stricter controls, duty rosters were tightened, and night access was reduced to a narrower circle of officers. None of this was explained as a reaction to espionage. It was framed as routine discipline, the kind of housekeeping an army on the move had to perform to survive. The general staff sensed that something had shifted. Patton had always demanded speed and aggression, but now he pressed even harder for compartmentalization. Plans were shared later, distributed more selectively, and altered more frequently. He insisted on redundancy, multiple options prepared in parallel, so that no single leak could compromise an entire operation. The effect was to increase friction inside headquarters while amplifying confusion for the enemy. Patton accepted the internal cost without apology. German intelligence, for its part, struggled to explain the sudden loss of clarity. Signals intercepts still provided fragments, reconnaissance flights still returned photographs, but the coherence was gone. Movements that should have converged did not. Units expected to meet resistance found gaps, others advanced into unexpected counterattacks. The enemy had not vanished, it had become unpredictable. For a commander who believed that speed was a weapon, unpredictability was a force multiplier. The experience reinforced Patton's long-standing skepticism toward static planning. He had seen too many carefully prepared operations undone by a single change in circumstance. Now he had proof that even the best-laid plans could be compromised by human weakness. His response was not to plan less, but to plan differently, to treat every plan as provisional and every timetable as negotiable. Orders emphasized intent over detail, allowing subordinate commanders to act without waiting for clarification. This philosophy flowed downward. Battalion and regimental commanders learned to operate with broader latitude, adjusting routes and objectives as conditions evolved. Communications emphasized reporting contact rather than requesting permission. The chain of command tightened around purpose rather than procedure. These habits would prove decisive when the tempo of operations accelerated and higher headquarters could not keep pace with events at the front. The episode also deepened Patton's mistrust of complacency. He believed that victory bred carelessness, and carelessness invited disaster. As Third Army pushed closer to Germany, he warned his officers that success made them more vulnerable, not less. The enemy, cornered and desperate, would look for asymmetric ways to strike, through deception, sabotage, and infiltration. The spy had been a reminder that the battlefield extended beyond the front lines. Within counterintelligence files, the case would later be categorized as limited in scope, damaging but contained. There was no evidence of a broader network inside Third Army headquarters, no indication that higher-level officers were compromised. Yet the damage inflicted before discovery could not be precisely measured. Lost lives rarely left clean paper trails. Patton understood this ambiguity and carried it with him, another unspoken weight layered onto command. As winter deepened and operations slowed under weather and logistics, Patton's emphasis on security remained. He encouraged skepticism without paranoia, discipline without rigidity. Officers were told to question anomalies, to report patterns that felt wrong even if they could not be proven. He trusted instinct when data lagged behind reality, a habit shaped by years of combat and reinforced by narrow escapes like this one. When Third Army later executed rapid maneuvers under extreme pressure, observers would credit Patton's audacity and speed. Fewer would notice the invisible scaffolding that made such audacity survivable, compartmented plans, resilient logistics, and a command climate that assumed uncertainty as the norm. The spy incident was not a dramatic turning point recorded in communiques, but it quietly informed how Patton managed risk thereafter. In Patton's war, justice was not performative. It was functional. He believed the primary obligation of command was to protect the mission and the men executing it, even when that meant absorbing moral discomfort or bypassing ritual. The episode did not make him reckless. It made him sharper. It confirmed his belief that the enemy was not always where doctrine said it would be, and that the cost of ignoring small irregularities could be catastrophic. As Third Army continued its advance, the map on Patton's wall changed daily. Lines moved, arrows shifted, pins were replaced. What did not change was the lesson drawn in a quiet office late one night, that modern war punished delay, rewarded vigilance, and offered no mercy for assumptions left unchallenged. Even as the snow began to melt and the roads turned to mud, Patton maintained an almost obsessive focus on the integrity of his operations. He walked the headquarters at all hours, not to intimidate but to observe. Officers and clerks knew they were being watched, yet the effect was not fear, it was accountability. Mistakes were corrected immediately. miscommunications addressed in person, and any hint of sloppiness became an opportunity to drill discipline rather than punish. Patton understood that vigilance had to be habitual, ingrained, or it would slip when the pressure of combat increased. The sergeant's betrayal also underscored a deeper truth for Patton. Loyalty was not inherited from rank or tenure. It had to be constantly earned, constantly verified. He began paying closer attention to human behavior within headquarters, noting who asked questions, who hesitated, who seemed distracted. He relied on instincts honed in years of observing both friend and foe. In war, the small cues mattered: a slip of the eye, a hesitation in speech, a nervous glance. Each could indicate compliance or compromise. Orders were rewritten in a way that minimized exposure, but they also carried redundancy. Patton mandated parallel copies of critical plans, routed through separate chains of command. Information was now on a need-to-know basis, even among close staff. Every step of the Third Army's advance became insulated against surprise, while still maintaining the speed and aggression he demanded on the front lines. It was a delicate balance. Too much secrecy slowed operations, too little exposed the Army to disaster. The ripple effects extended to training exercises as well. Staff officers were drilled on counterintelligence awareness. Communications officers learned to detect anomalies in message traffic. Clerical personnel were reminded that seemingly mundane actions, photocopying, photographing, misfiling, could carry consequences measured in lives. Patton framed this as professional responsibility rather than punishment. He was teaching vigilance as a strategic tool, turning a near catastrophe into an operational doctrine. Patton's approach was quietly revolutionary. By integrating security, adaptability, and speed, he created a system that could absorb human error without collapsing. It was a lesson the Germans never anticipated. While they sought to exploit weaknesses through spies and subterfuge, the Third Army became a moving target, dynamic and unpredictable. When intelligence reports hinted at patterns, Patton was already changing them, often before the enemy could act. The general's reputation for intuition and boldness had always been deserved, but episodes like this highlighted another, less visible quality, an almost forensic attention to risk management. Patton's ability to foresee vulnerabilities, to recognize the unseen enemy in his own ranks, and to act decisively without hesitation, was as lethal as his command of armor and artillery. This dual mastery, strategic foresight and tactical execution, explained why Hitler feared him, why subordinate officers respected him, and why his campaigns succeeded when others faltered. Even in the war's final months, as Third Army pushed into Germany, Patton's lessons from that night remained embedded in operations. Every convoy, every intelligence report, every route selection reflected an awareness that the smallest lapse could have strategic consequences. The sergeant's betrayal had been contained, but its implications reverberated endlessly, shaping how one of America's most audacious generals structured command, protected his forces, and maintained the initiative in a war defined by uncertainty. Patton's heightened focus on internal security also transformed the culture of the Third Army in subtle but powerful ways. Officers and enlisted men alike began to operate with a constant awareness that information was a weapon as potent as artillery, and that mistakes in handling it could have lethal consequences. Reports were double-checked, schedules masked, and movements rehearsed with the assumption that the enemy was always watching. This mindset became second nature, instilling a sense of shared responsibility that strengthened cohesion under pressure. Beyond procedural changes, Patton's response to the spy incident reinforced the principle that decisive action trumped bureaucracy. While other commands might have been paralyzed by regulations, needing weeks for investigations and approvals, Patton demonstrated that the life of the Army and the success of the mission demanded immediate judgment. It was a living lesson for subordinate commanders. In war, hesitation could be deadly, and the ability to act independently within the framework of intent was essential. At the operational level, this insistence on vigilance and adaptability directly influenced planning for the next offensive. Routes were shifted, supply points concealed, and timing adjusted to ensure that the Germans could not anticipate the main thrust. Reconnaissance teams moved ahead with specific instructions to detect anomalies rather than simply report terrain. Artillery schedules were altered at the last minute to maximize surprise. Even the timing of radio communications was varied, creating uncertainty in any enemy analysis of Third Army activity. Patton treated deception and security not as secondary considerations, but as integral components of combat power. The sergeant's betrayal also illuminated a broader truth that Patton had long understood. War was fought as much in the shadows as on the battlefield. Command decisions, intelligence assessments, and the movement of men and materiel could be rendered meaningless by leaks or misjudgments. By addressing the threat decisively and silently, Patton ensured that Third Army retained its operational integrity while keeping morale high and maintaining the confidence of both his superiors and subordinates. As the army moved forward into Germany, the lessons of that night became embedded in institutional practices. Field orders now carried coded references to reduce risk, document handling was strictly regimented, and officers were trained to recognize patterns of suspicious behavior. These measures did not slow operations. Instead, they accelerated them, because units could act confidently knowing that their plans were secure and that contingencies had been considered. The Army became a self-correcting system, capable of responding rapidly to changing circumstances without exposing itself to unnecessary risk. Patton himself continued to lead from the front, but with an acute awareness that his authority extended beyond mere presence on the battlefield. Command required foresight, anticipation of both enemy and internal threats, and the ability to integrate all elements of an operation under pressure. The spy incident had crystallized this understanding, proving that strategic success demanded both audacity and vigilance. Patton's ability to balance these elements became a defining feature of Third Army operations, and a key reason why the forces under his command maintained momentum even in the most chaotic conditions. In every subsequent engagement, the imprint of that night was evident. Plans were more flexible, staff officers were more attentive, and units executed orders with precision tempered by situational awareness. German commanders, facing an American army that moved with speed, unpredictability, and operational security, found their own calculations repeatedly disrupted. The Third Army's ability to recover from setbacks, exploit weaknesses, and maintain initiative was strengthened not only by tanks, artillery, and air power, but by a culture of vigilance and decisive judgment that had been forged under the pressure of betrayal.